Thanks for joining us tonight. Tonight's Skillshare is Implementing NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. My name is Laura Santoyo, and I serve as the Secretary for National EMP. I also serve as one of the members of the Advocacy Committee. I wanted to take this opportunity to share that we are currently transitioning to a new membership platform called the Mighty Network. So if you are not with us on that network yet, we really encourage you to join us there. On this platform, you'll find a discussion board. That's where people post internship and job postings. You'll see a review of museum studies program and other resources, and they're all for free. Sometime during the presentation, I'll drop that link for everybody in the chat if you're interested in joining us there. Some quick housekeeping rules before we start. This presentation is being recorded for future use. So I don't think anyone besides the presenters and myself are on video right now, but if you would like to remain off video, you are welcome to keep your video off so that you're not in the recording. The recording will become available on our YouTube channel at a later date if you wish to come back to it. Please keep yourself on mute during the presentation, and that's just so that we can hear the speakers and there's no distractions or background noise. And then if you have questions for our speakers, that's great. We just ask that you drop your questions in the chat box, and there'll be a Q&A session at the end. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers. Amati is the NAGPRA Coordinator at the University of Denver Museum of Anthropology in Denver, Colorado. She's responsible for NAGPRA compliance, as well as ensuring that the university is cultivating and maintaining good relationships with tribes. Ms. Amati is the PI for a 3-year initiative to develop the NAGPRA Community of Practice, which is a network for individuals engaged in implementing the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, or NAGPRA, funded by an IMLS National Leadership Grant for museums. Deanna Byrd serves as the NAGPRA Liaison-Coordinator for the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. She is currently working with several institutions across the United States for the respectful repatriation of Chahta ancestors as part of a comprehensive nationwide search. Deanna works to educate youth on the importance of Choctaw Historic Preservation, Indigenous Archaeology, tribal collaboration and advocacy, and NAGPRA in classroom settings across the country. She has authored several historical articles for a monthly column in the National Choctaw Publication. I apologize, Deanna, if I mispronounce this. Biskinik. Okay, great. On topics related to the Choctaw community during her 6 years of service to her tribe. And without further ado, take it away, Anne and Deanna.
Okay, hello everyone. I'm gonna screen share and we're gonna watch a video together. Can everyone see this okay? Can I get a thumbs up still? Okay.
When you think about Choctaw traditional culture, it's something that was created cumulatively over about 600 generations when our ancestors lived in the Choctaw homeland. So when we practice Choctaw traditional culture, it connects us with those 600 generations of forebears, it connects us with our homeland, and with all the places that our ancestors lived in the past. So today, even as a removed tribe, the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma, when people speak Choctaw language, when people do traditional arts, when people do traditional food, all of that connects us back with our homeland, including places like Moundville.
That was home to a lot of groups of our people. And a lot of Southeastern tribes came from that group.
Moundville was like a ceremonial center for an extended farming community along that river, and it had connections with farming communities located in other areas, such as the Tombigbee River, a little more close to the heart of the Choctaw homeland. At the height of Moundville, about 1250 AD or so, there were half as many people living there as in London at the same time. It was the second largest Native American community north of the Valley of Mexico at that time.
Connection between the mounds is evident. It's evident on the pottery.
This pottery right here is I got the clay from Moundsville, and I cleaned it, the leaves and the rocks and the sticks out of it, and cleaned it. Then I molded it.
The clay in the Choctaw language is lokfemia, that means the fat of the earth.
I was like in awe because I looked around, there was these mounds all over the place. There's one big one when you first go in, there's one big one, and there's some smaller ones, and then I've never seen nothing like this. I was never able to do anything like this when I was younger. I didn't know about it. And when I see that, it just kind of it was awesome.
When people make traditional pottery out of Moundville clay, or when people make it out of clay from the Tombigbee River, different places in our homeland, they're reconnecting with ancestors like that.
Man, I can make these things now. It's not any different than what they made, and I could use this as cooking or putting my medicine in and crushing it, or boiling my things for plants, for medicines, and eating out of and storing things in, things like that. And that's what they did a long time ago.
When Choctaw folks left the homeland on the Trail of Tears to come to Oklahoma, one of the things that they carried with them were clay eating bowls. And that wasn't just so they would have something to eat in, but those clay eating bowls represented the homeland. They were literally made from the soil of the Choctaw homeland. And not only that, but pottery making is a tradition that goes through the female line. So when they were carrying those clay eating bowls, they were carrying the homeland and the female line with them.
I never believed it till I seen that. It's just, I don't know, it's overwhelming now. I'm doing things that they done a long time ago. And it started out with just being for myself.
People in this culture today have a lot to learn from that, from the ancestors. Our ancestors buried their dead right there at home, which means we revered the bones, we revered our ancestors.
They respected the remains, and I don't think they ever had a problem of, anybody disrespecting. Now, we're not trying to be unkind, but it was the non-natives that sort of brought that problem. And because natives respected burials, they never bothered it. And so that was just the way it was, that we were taught that it's a sacred place. You don't go around it, you just leave it alone. The Choctaw word today for a funeral, the process of a funeral service is ayakshutji. Ayakshutji means, I means a location. Ikshutji means to make it disappear. Now, that has to be a Christian concept, because if you recall, Choctaws didn't bury their dead. They put it on a scaffold, and then they would wait for however long the body began to decay. And then that's when the bone picker would go up there and selected the bones and handed it down to the relatives for it to be put in a bone house. If you look at this from the way that a Choctaw would be looking at it, it was very therapeutic, because it was a long time of grieving, and the Choctaw would come and the relatives would come when they feel like it, and the body would be up on a scaffold, and they had time to cry, they had time to talk, they had to do anything. It's a gradual let go. So that's what, for generations, that's how they were taking care of their deceased. But when Christianity came, they were taught to bury the dead in the ground. And so that would make sense when this is Ayik Shuchi, means a place where it suddenly disappears. So to the Choctaw mind, instead of 3-month-long duration of watching a deceased decay out, they all of a sudden it's gone, you know. And so that word came about, Ayik Shuchi, means to a place to make it disappear.
As our ancestors rest, as they lay in rest, they got their bones disturbed. Earthly remains are not being respected, not being left to rest.
Our sacred objects were taken out of sacred sites and held in institutions. And NAGPRA opened our eyes to what history did to our people.
NAGPRA stands for the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. It was essentially legislation that opened up conversations that Native American communities were never able to have before, so that we could understand exactly where our ancestors are. We know that they were taken out of our homeland. We know that they were excavated at different points in time. So we're able to go and knock on these doors and be able to find them.
One of the incidents that helped to bring advocacy for creating what became NAGPRA about was an instance where there was a cemetery that had to be moved because of the construction project. The other ethnic groups that were in that cemetery, you know, their remains were exhumed and they're ultimately reburied. But there happened to be a few Native people in that cemetery. Their graves were exhumed and then put onto a shelf in a collection, never got reburied. It's because of that different standard that NAGPRA was ultimately created.
Our ancestors were dug up, put on display, studied, and never put back. And as Choctaw people, we feel like it is our duty to rebury them.
Appreciate the NAGPRA process that we have going on. It's gotten better and good at collecting a lot of the bones from the institutions. And a lot of them are starting to realize that they ought to be respectfully placed back where they came from.
I began doing NAGPRA work for the Choctaw Nation when I was still a student. It was before I began working full-time for the tribe. It was in 2008. But one of my jobs was to look through the collection and see which things probably did come from burials, which I did. You know, there were multiple levels of that. Some of the artifacts were modern reproduction, so it involved looking for tool marks and that kind of thing. You know,
That's been years ago when I worked with NAGPRA. But what I remember was that it was a new program for us.
My first experience with NAGPRA was probably when it became an act, you know, the Native American Repatriation Act, back in 1990, I think. And when the tribe first was introduced to it, they had a gentleman who they asked to take and look into it. He probably stayed in it about a month. And then they asked me to take it on. So it was around the early years of 1990 when I was first exposed to the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act.
A lot of times we find inventories and they aren't really affiliated with the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma, and they're not really funerary. Sometimes they're actually cultural items that we can provide information for their collections and their teaching collections that are non-NAGPRA.
The process itself is meticulous, it's mind-boggling, and there's roadblocks, there's papers with I's to dot and all of that stuff.
The first time we had to, of course, we had to go to classes to learn more about NAGPRA. And that's when we had to travel to other tribes, do a lot of meetings.
The last person that I hired to take the training, we took it together and learned the laws and everything about it, and decided that this was an important part of our Choctaw people, especially our ancestors.
As Choctaw Nation Historic Preservation Department has gained more staff, more positions, more folks that are trained in different areas, we've been able to create a full-time NAGPRA Coordinator, NAGPRA Liaison position. And that person is able to spend a good bit of her work hours doing this. She's been systematic about it, going state by state, contacting every conceivable federal collection in that state and setting up consultation.
When I first started on this project about 3 years ago, I was very enthusiastic. Coming from a research background, I thought, oh, it's going to take me a year. I'm going to know exactly where they are. We're going to have them all repatriated. This is going to be great. And I had a dear friend in the NAGPRA community tell me, this is multi-generational work. And I really had to let that sit in. Our hope is to be able to search the United States and at least know where our ancestors are. They may not all be repatriated in my lifetime, but we're trying to find them. Part of that process is we have a documentation campaign, and we reach out to all of these institutions. We send them a packet and we ask them for their inventory. We share their research document with them in hopes that they can search their database. And then we hope to have a really meaningful dialogue. We work through the legal process to repatriate them so that they can come home, or that we can rebury them as close as possible to where they were originally excavated from. If we are not able to get them back as close as we can, then we try to find a forest or a private location that we can do that.
So when we started to rebury some of the bones that we got back from the other institutions through the NAGPRA process, we had to come up with a ceremony, because there is no ceremony for reburials. And we wanted to do it with as much respect and honor as possible.
It wasn't something that we thought we would have to do. I mean, who grows up thinking that they're going to have to rebury their grandma? So, you don't, it's something that we just don't grow up doing, is thinking that we have to do this. And so the advisory board really came around to, say, what do we need to do? This is what's came up. How do we rectify it, and how do we get these people, our ancestors, back at peace?
The Choctaw Nation NAGPRA Advisory Board was created, I believe, in 2009. And its purpose was to bring together respected cultural leaders to advise on the NAGPRA work that the Choctaw Nation Historic Preservation Department did. Sometimes questions come up and they're difficult to answer, either culturally or in terms of procedure or relationships with other groups. So this board advises us to make sure that we follow Choctaw culture, that we follow the will of the community as we're doing this work.
And some of these questions have to do with really developing ceremony that were never meant to have. They were asking questions about protocols on how to prepare our ancestors to be brought home for repatriation.
So we've taken an approach, with the NAGPRA Advisory Board, and also with two different religious leaders. One of those people is Les Williston, who's a traditional Choctaw religious practitioner. The other person is Olin Williams. He's a first language Choctaw speaker, lots of cultural knowledge, and he's also a cultural minister.
It was trial and error, because we have been Christians for so long now, and now these remains, maybe most of them were not from Christian. So some people thought that we need to do as traditional as we can, and then some felt like, well, we're Christians now, so we need to do Christian ceremony. So what we did was we combined the two. And I would do the Christian prayer, and then Les Williston would do the traditional. That way we covered both.
Time we had to bury a whole bunch of people. Dug all the holes. And then we started the work, started the ceremony, clean each hole, clean the ground. That's a blessing. That's for forgiveness. Do all the things that I had put together for it. But I didn't know. I didn't know when I climbed into that grave what it was gonna feel like to take these bones of our ancestors and put them in the grave one by one. One by one. You start, when you feel that, when you get them handed to you and you pick them up, you feel that energy. Bones, skulls, baby bones. I broke down. I couldn't help it. Couldn't stop it. And that was a powerful time. And I'll never forget it.
My first experience working with a group of students who were archaeologists helped us rebury some of the ancestors. And as we were reburying them and putting them back, they started crying, when we sung their songs. And I think they felt like what their ancestors did was wrong. And they felt it as they were putting back those bones that belonged to our people.
I think the hardest inventory that I had, or the hardest experience that I had, was going through an inventory and realizing that at the time that this child was brought in, that the curation staff had made the decision to separate that child, that small child, from their carved bone comb. And I still feel that. It was very early on. It was one of my very first inventories that I ever reviewed and looked through. And it's always stuck with me that, just envisioning the mother there, the relatives there at that gravesite for that small child and placing that bone comb there. As a mother myself, losing a child myself, I imagine what that was like. And I had to kind of take a break and step away for a little while because, it's real. That little girl was real.
It was really disheartening. And, you go into that place and, you think, again, that's my family. Being there with Deanna and helping her just be able to get through this inventory is something that, to me, I don't think you can do alone. We sit, we talk, we cry, and then we pray. And really just to let the ancestors know that we're we're trying our best, and we're going to do our best to help them have peace.
It's been an honor being on the NAGPRA board. Many of the things we talk about in there are really interesting stuff. And we find out there's so much has to be done.
The 30-year mark of NAGPRA, we find ourselves with a tremendous amount of work left to be done. And in the last 10 years, while I've been involved in doing NAGPRA work, there have definitely been positive developments. There are coalitions between tribes that have been really helpful in seeing the law followed and seeing our ancestors respectfully returned and reburied.
I feel really honored to be in this role, and I have to. I have frank conversations with my children sometimes. They don't sometimes they'll buck, when Missy and I have to go travel, and they're like, why are you gonna go? And I'm like, you just gotta give me 3 days with the ancestors and then I'll be back, and I let them know, we're doing this so that you don't have to, that, future generations don't have to do this.
I just think that if our own young people would take time to listen to the elders and retain as much as they can about our value system, then we can improve NAGPRA.
If they don't all come back from institutions in our lifetime, at least we know where they are. We've left no stone unturned so that we can find them.
So, to the institutions that still have our remains, have our funerary objects, or any of our artifacts, need to know that it belongs to our people as well as other tribal nations, that they need to be returned to those people.
Doing this work, it's really powerful. I've seen things that Western science says don't exist, like repeatedly when we do this. It's the real thing, and I'm so honored to be involved in that. Just a small way getting to right, not even right or wrong, but just take it a little bit back towards how it should be. Just a little bit of honor. I'm grateful to the Choctaw Nation for letting me do this work, and to all the people who contribute. It's a big team effort.
And I'll pass it on to you to
Okay.
here.
Thanks, Deanna. And thank you for sharing that video with us. I think it's really important to frame the discussion around NAGPRA by starting with the tribal perspective. And I think that video was very powerful in doing that. So thank you for sharing that. I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to talk a little bit of some NAGPRA basics. Before I get started, I just wanted to say that I'm grateful to be here today to talk with you about NAGPRA. I'm very passionate about this work, and I want to acknowledge the many tribal, museum, and federal mentors that have impacted my understanding and appreciation of NAGPRA over the years. So one of the first things to understand is who needs to comply with the law. Institutions that receive federal funds and hold Native American collections are required to comply as museums under the law. The law that was passed about a year before NAGPRA. But so the institutions that receive federal funds and hold Native American collections, that includes some institutions that we don't often think of as museums, such as universities, federal and state agencies, local governments, even coroners' offices are considered museums under NAGPRA. We also need to understand who has standing to make requests for repatriations under the law. Federally recognized tribes are those tribes eligible for funding and services from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and that includes Native Alaskan villages. Native Hawaiian organizations that serve and represent the interests of Native Hawaiians also have standing to make claims. Lineal descendants are eligible to make claims on human remains, funerary objects, and sacred objects. And there are many tribes that are not recognized by the federal government. In NAGPRA, these are referred to as non-federally recognized groups. They do not have standing under some parts of the law, but sometimes they can partner with federally recognized tribes to go through the NAGPRA process. What objects are eligible under NAGPRA for repatriation? We have four main categories of objects. Human remains are the physical remains of a person of Native American ancestry hair made into ropes or nets. Funerary objects are objects that are placed with individual human remains either at the time of death or later as part of the death rite or ceremony of a culture. They are associated if the human remains are presently in the possession or control of the museum or another institution. And they are considered unassociated if the remains are not in the possession or control of the museum or another institution. So if you know where the remains are, they're associated funerary objects. If you don't know where the remains are, they're unassociated. Sacred objects are specific ceremonial objects that are needed by religious leaders for the practice of traditional Native American religions by their present day adherents. Claims do not need to name specific ceremonies. And then objects of cultural patrimony are objects, excuse me, objects having ongoing historical, traditional, or cultural importance central to the Native American group or culture itself. These are not owned by an individual and cannot be alienated, appropriated, or conveyed by any individual. And they must be considered inalienable at the time they were separated from the community. We thought we'd organize the remainder of the session around these 3 perceived challenges to NAGPRA: consultation, time, and resources. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Deanna.
Okay, so I get asked this question a lot about consultation and, what's the perfect strategy for working with tribes, or can you offer us any suggestions? A lot of times, people are just starting out and don't have much training. And so, what I always say, my number one thing that I say first is that it's different for every Indigenous community that you're going to work with. And it's really important to reach out to them early and through that whole process so that you can develop a working relationship. But one of the things by far, I think, that needs to happen is this move to respect. And so I've kind of developed an acronym for that. And for the R, it's that reciprocity, it's that information sharing, sharing records, sharing the inventory, what that looks like. Sometimes, it's scanty, but being able to say, what, I think there's some loan information. Let me share that with you. Here's some images. How would you like me to send those? Is it okay just to send in an email, or would you rather me send it in a OneDrive link and mark it sensitive? But that information sharing, and then also respectfully getting that information from the tribal representative. So finding out maybe who that is and who has permission to share that information and consult with you. The other one is establishing a relationship and a working relationship. It's not a one-time email. It's not a one-time letterhead, with the university or museum or institution on it that says, hey, we're doing a thing. It's a working relationship and saying, how would you like to proceed? You've been identified. I've done my homework to realize that other tribes in your community, we want to be a part of consultation. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about protocol. Let's talk about things we can't talk about, but really developing a working relationship and putting the time in to develop that further. The S is for start before research begins. And so you want this to be inclusive. I always talk to people about casting that net wide. It's not really your job to pinpoint exactly who. That's not really a decision that needs to be made, but you want to have an inclusive conversation. And so most of the times when I advocate for casting that net really wide, I'm very happy to see that, a lot of people are just, hey, this is my preference, or I want to defer to this tribal community over, I thank you for the email, thank you for the invite. But I'm always really pleased, we know our history, we know we've worked together for a very long time. And so we have this shared ancestry a lot of times, or we have a working relationship. And so, allowing us the opportunity to say, what, I'm going to defer on this, or thank you for the inclusion. I really do want to be a part of this consultation. So start your research early and start that homework, work with National NAGPRA, and they can direct you to who you need to contact. The P is for patience. I think that oftentimes, the biggest frustration I have is I want to participate in something, or I want to be a part of something, but it's kind of a set timeline. And those aren't really successful. In our office, we're very fortunate to have different programs and staff for those programs. But oftentimes that's not the case for other tribal communities. And I know that we get busy and they get busy, and there's a lot of things that are going on in our community. I know that there's some individuals that are teaching language classes, also doing NAGPRA and doing Section 106 review and doing other things in their community. And so it's really important to have patience, and doodle polls are your friend. You know, have some dates there that are available and kind of put those out there, and then allow those responses to come back in. Again, working with developing that relationship and that inclusive relationship means following up. If you don't hear something, you know, be patient. It's not gonna happen tomorrow. And like I said about my frustration, you know, so sometimes it's like, hey, I want to have this meeting, you know, in 2 days, you know, sometimes that's not possible. So it's really about having that patience and that respect. Also, you know, I think this is a given, but each Indigenous community is unique. There's no generalizations. And so it's important for you to do your homework before you start consultation. Also, this is hard to hear, but check your ego. I know that a lot of us are educated. We've gone through school, we've gone through classes that talk to us about our bias, or talk to us about, you know, we've learned all kinds of history, and somehow that makes us the experts. But I'm, you know, very pleased to say that I learn something new every day. And so I think it's about checking your ego when you go in to consultation, and with that mindset of having an open heart and an open mind. And then also transparency, having that full disclosure. You know, I always find it wonderful to hear someone, you know, just admit, you know, I'm new at this. I don't have the records, but I'm going to hunt them down. I'm going to work with maybe the past person that I took their job, the past curator. I'm going to hunt down these records. But just that full disclosure. Also, full disclosure about what the condition of the collection is like. You know, if their inventory is out of compliance, I think that that's a really good thing to say. You know, hey, this is where we're at. I think that one of the relationship building institutions that is a success story in my mind is somebody who, you know, found some really disturbing curation techniques. There was markings on human remains, there was tags, there was staples, and just disclosing that and saying, this is not something that I would do. This is not something I prefer, but I want you to know the state of the collection. I want you to know what your ancestors are experiencing at this time. And I think that full disclosure helps with that trust and helps with that relationship building. Okay. Next slide, Anne. I think I can.
All of a sudden, it doesn't want to go forward. Hold on, let's do this.
Okay.
There we go.
All right. So, and I think that, you know, it's really important, as I was saying before, it's not, you know, any museum professional's job to understand exactly and pinpoint in time and determine that cultural affiliation all by themselves in a vacuum. I think it's really important to do consultation really early, get as many voices, work with National NAGPRA. They have tools, they have resources, they have personnel to help you. And it's really about a shared group identity and linking that through a present day Indian tribe and as an identifiable earlier group. That's it. It's not a dissertation. It's not a book. It's not wealth of information that's going to do that. You know, again, successful experiences with institutions that have done some consulting here recently was being able to look at that and say, you know, your language and these other lines of evidence that, you know, that works for me. And it's really not rocket science, and it shouldn't be that hard. And I think that it's important to go, you know, what is my role here? What is my job when I'm determining cultural affiliation? And that there's lots of help for that. As NAGPRA has outlined, there's 10 lines of evidence, and not all of these have to be included in that cultural affiliation consultation. But again, consulting early, working with the tribal community, you can look at these. And the successful experience I was talking to you actually ended up kind of finalizing on expert opinion. And those were taking oral stories from our community that were then looked as expert opinion. And so none of the other criteria here were really even considered as part of that major support for cultural affiliation, but it was the expert opinion that was. Next slide. And so I'll finish with this one. This is something that I kind of put together for another presentation, but it's worked really well to demonstrate that this is why tribal consultation is important, and it's important very early on, because each tribal community understands their history. They understand their community, they understand their movement through time, their placement on the landscape. If they're a removed tribe like the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma, we understand what our interaction was on the landscape in our homeland, but we also understood what it was like with other tribal communities that were surrounding us. And so this is just an example of, the star that's on this map is on this French map shows that this is where Choctaw people were living at this time in the 1700s. But you can see of all the other colors from, historical archives, place names, oral history, land management practices that we still practice today, river clay sourcing and our basketry, all of these lines of interaction have no real representation other than the star. And so, you really have to consider that the Indigenous communities you're working with, they know their stuff, they know their history, they know their community. And so you're not going to get this picture unless you consult with them. And so oftentimes, this could be that other relevant information or expert opinion or oral tradition. And a lot of times museums and the boards and, kind of the higher ups at institutions will want to place it on the archaeological evidence or history. Where is it written? Well, it's not written down. I can't find one single publication of a Western kind of world publication that talks about the interaction of where we got river cane and how we sourced it and where we brought it back. There's documentation that can talk about, some of those hunting grounds and but it's really, the community interaction between like some of the other tribes, say the Chickasaw Nation and the Muscogee Creek Nation, and our stickball heritage today. It's very strong in our community today. There's reports of stickball tournaments over hunting land and the right to use that for that season. But looking at our communities today and talking to us today, you would know that stickball is a huge part of our life. So it's very important to reach out to tribes and consult early.
Thanks, Deanna.
You're welcome.
So cultural affiliation is sort of how we decide who is connected to the human remains or the cultural items so that we can determine who we're repatriating to. And it's important to understand what the standard of proof is for making that determination. And it's a reasonable basis or preponderance of the evidence, which is a very low standard. It is not beyond a reasonable doubt. It is not a scientific certainty. It's important to understand that, tribes will provide evidence. You will have information in your own museum records that will help make the cultural affiliation determination. And it's a very low standard of proof that you have to meet. I don't know why it keeps not wanting me to change the slide. So sometimes a museum cannot make a cultural affiliation determination. In that case, it's called a culturally unidentifiable or culturally unidentifiable inventory. In that case, there are still paths for moving forward with the NAGPRA process. And in that situation, instead of making a cultural connection, we're making a geographic connection. And this is one of the tools that we can use to make the geographic to ask the tribes and work with the tribes and defer to the tribes in terms of what their land is where they originally occupied, because that's how we make a geographic connection between the human remains or the cultural items in our collection and the present day tribe. So in the interest of time, I'm going to skip the 2 slides on time, which went a little more in depth into the process, so that we can allow for questions. But essentially, there's one process for the sacred items, objects of cultural patrimony, and unassociated funerary objects. They start with making a summary, which is a generalized list of objects in your collection. And you don't need to know what are sacred objects, what are objects of cultural patrimony. You identify those through consultation. So by creating a summary, you should include all the Native American collections in that summary, and you should share it with tribes that are possibly culturally connected. And then you'll consult with the tribes, and then they'll make the request identifying them as a NAGPRA object. And then there's a different process for human remains and funerary objects. In those cases, we consult with the tribe to create an inventory, which is an item by item list. And then once the inventory is complete, then a tribe can make a request for repatriation, and we can repatriate. I really wanted to touch on a few resources that are available, because oftentimes it can seem very overwhelming if you are in the position of doing NAGPRA for the first time. And one of the best resources is the National NAGPRA Program website. They have databases on there where you can check the status of NAGPRA implementation for your own institution, or maybe another institution you're interested in looking at. The National NAGPRA Program also offers grants to support repatriations and consultations. And there's all sorts of information on the website about those grant programs. Another really good resource to learn about NAGPRA is to look at federal register notices, which you can do by searching federalregister.gov. And if you search NAGPRA, then NAGPRA notices will come up. And by reading NAGPRA notices, it's a great way to learn and see what other people, information that other people had about their collections, and who they consulted with and who they culturally affiliated with. And it could be a really great resource. Another good resource is the NAGPRA Community of Practice. This is a group that was created of, by, and for the NAGPRA community to connect, collaborate, and build capacity. We host bi-monthly calls. We have a Facebook and LinkedIn group. We have a listserv where you can ask questions or post information. We have a Google Share Drive where people can share documents and templates. And we're also working to create a directory of practitioners that is available on the Google Share Drive. And we also share it with the National NAGPRA Program, and it's updated regularly. And there at the bottom of the screen is the website, but if you just search for University of Denver NAGPRA, you'll find that website and find information on the community of practice. That was a little quick going through the slideshow, but I wanted to leave time for questions, and we can always go back to that process, those process slides, if that's where people have questions. But I'd love to hear from the audience if you have questions for Deanna or myself.
Yeah, so let's go ahead and open it up. You're welcome to drop any questions you have for our speakers in the chat, or if you prefer, you can unmute yourselves and ask your questions that way.
Raylan has said, awesome slide. I really like this advice for tribal consultation. Was that in response to the respect slide, I think? I like that. I love that too.
Hi, thank you so much for presenting today. This is a great amount of information. I really appreciate it. I was just wanting to double check or clarify, repercussions for those institutions that unfortunately are too stubborn, we'll put it that way, to comply. with NAGPRA, those repercussions would be that loss in federal funding. Would there be any other repercussions that institution would face?
There are civil penalties for non-compliance. Unfortunately, with a lot of institutions that might seem, might put obstacles in front of repatriation, oftentimes they are actually in compliance, even though they're not really going along with the spirit of the law.
Oh, okay, interesting.
But I don't know, Deanna, do you have anything to add?
Well, one of the things that I think is important to point out, and I wouldn't have really appreciated this fact until recently. I had the privilege of going through, when we moved into our new cultural center, I had the privilege of going through a whole lot of old documents that were in storage and in these tubs and whatnot, and trying to go through and see what's been scanned in and what needs to be tossed and that kind of thing. What I came across was a gold mine for my NAGPRA project, because it was really early on after the legislation was passed. And a lot of museums and institutions flooded us with these inventories, requests for consultations. I mean, there's hundreds of documents, and they were just sitting collecting dust. And I actually bumped into a big shout out to Judy Allen. She was the person who received all of this. And at the time, they didn't know what to do with it. And so she organized it by state. And so it's really great because, with our project, we're going systematically through the United States. And oftentimes there is that, well, we're not in compliance or that, but there is that letter. A lot of times I can refer back to that. So I think it's important to understand what that history of compliance is with the institution you're working for. Sometimes there is that initial push to do it right when legislation happened, and it just kind of fell through the cracks. Everyone kind of thought the other person sent it in or the other person completed it. And then, like you said, there are those institutions that are just straight up stubborn and haven't completed it. So I think it's important to have a conversation and do some digging. I know that for one institution up north, they had spent some time and energy and resources doing an inventory completely on a VHS camera. And so that was an interesting hurdle that we had to get through and take screenshots of that. But there was that earlier work that was done. And, she was a new curator, 20 years later, and was having to sort through that and was able to go, oh, okay, I know where this is. And it turned out that there was 3, maybe 4 institutions that joined together their resources to put that together. So when she was saying these things aren't here, these items, these baskets, these cultural items aren't here, they were over at the other institution. So it kind of helps, follow those breadcrumbs kind of thing. But that's what I have to offer about that.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much.
Great question. We have another good question in the chat. Jesse says, I've encountered a lot of smaller museums or very local museums who have no real collections inventory or database to speak of for their collections, which would contain objects of cultural patrimony or other collections subject to NAGPRA. Have you encountered that? And is there any advice for museum folks who might encounter that kind of museum collection?
I turned my video off because I'm having unstable internet connection, but I have worked with smaller museums. I think it's important. One of the things that NAGPRA has done is really pointed out the bad collection information that museums have. And it is required by federal law that museums complete an inventory and they complete a summary, regardless of whether they have a real collections inventory or database. It's also important to understand, smaller institutions, there is help available to help get that work done. And that's one of the things that the community of practice is really focused on, is putting people in touch with other folks who can help, maybe give some advice or give some information on how to do a summary, how to do an inventory. I had a small museum that I worked with that they had done their inventory and then they hadn't followed up at all. And so they were technically in compliance, but they were able to get a NAGPRA grant and actually repatriate because they were able to be proactive. So that is possible with smaller institutions.
Yes, and I was just going to add that a lot of time that early consultation, just contacting National NAGPRA and saying, how do I help? I've worked with several and small institutions on the East Coast. And, sometimes it's just, an elderly woman who's volunteered for this kind of collection review or didn't really realize how big it was. And there wasn't any inventory that's ever been done or no database. And so, identifying those needs with National NAGPRA and the identifying the potential tribal partners allows that when they apply for grant funding, they can potentially get a letter of support. I know that we've sent several in the last year because of COVID, offering to get, that assistance and for them to complete that inventory. But a letter of support from a tribe really works well in their favor. And so that's why it's important to do consultation early on. I know that one of the things I hear from them too is, I'm just one person. I feel like I'm just kind of screaming into the wind with all of the workload that entails. And, I would suggest, one is to come to the community of practice. You're going to hear that a lot and some problem solving that happens. And so it's a wonderful place to connect with other museum professionals. And then also, don't underestimate students, from colleges. Right now, I just gave a presentation earlier this afternoon from 8 interns from all over the country that wanted to come here and work for the summer. And so there's always resources available. And I know it seems pretty daunting and scary, like you're the only one, but both tribes and students in the community of practice, you have those support system in place.
I want to thank Angela for sharing the document, the link in the chat for that lists the 9 ways you can fail to comply. That's a really helpful resource.
I have a question. So say that you're in compliance, you've done the inventory, you've even had like tribal representatives contact your museum and say, hey, we'd like, just an inventory or summary of all items identified as, X tribe. And then you send that letter and then you never hear back. And maybe it's been years. How, do you see that a lot? And what is your advice for someone who might encounter that? Like, should we follow up? How soon should you follow up? Because, speaking to your acronym, Deanna, patience. So, what advice do you have for someone where that might happen?
Did you want to touch that, Ann? Or
I can speak to it, but I'd like to hear, from your perspective too. I know that the tribal representatives are very busy. Yeah. But in my experience, what I do is I send, when I'm sending formal letters, I send them to tribal leadership and I CC the NAGPRA representative. And then I usually follow up 2 weeks afterwards. And I follow up by phone and by email. And depending on what I'm contacting them about, I may continue to do that until I get in touch with someone, or I may, if it's really just a notification and I don't really need to hear back from someone, I'll let it drop. But I'd love to hear, Deanna, your perspective on it.
Okay, so there's a few things to kind of disentangle in that, right? The first thing I think is really identifying who you're trying to contact, and researching a little bit about what that leadership looks like and who that designated person. We do get a lot of letters that are trickled down to our office in historic preservation that have first gone to chief's office. And sometimes it's not to the correct chief. So, it's important to understand what that history looks like, what the current leadership looks like, and then also who it needs to be addressed to. For our tribe, like I said before, we have a designated in the video, pointed out, we do have, because resources have grown over time, we have now a designated position for my program. However, that wasn't the case. And so, as I was mentioning earlier about all of the old correspondence, that was going to a tribal historian, and they had no idea what to do with it. Historic preservation did not exist. Out of all of the federally recognized tribes who can apply for tribal historic preservation status, not all of them have that. And if they are, they're one person and they're doing, like I said, language classes, culture classes, they're doing Section 106 reviews, they're concentrating on what their community sees at that time as important. And so they may not be responding depending on what their workload is. So, that's kind of some things to kind of keep in mind in the background that's happening. And, and from experience from our tribe as well. The other thing is that, I would suggest getting yourself on some sort of schedule, whether, like Ann said, where it's like 2 weeks and then, you're like, okay, I'm going to wait. But making that a priority, because there is shift in leadership, because there is new positions coming in, sometimes that might look like quarterly. Sometimes it might, for your institution, look like every 6 months, I'm going to send these letters out and get these feelers because I'm not hearing anything. And I think the number one thing that I can advise is please don't assume because there's no response that we don't care. And I'll tell you an example. So going through that correspondence, there was a letter, and of course it was sent to the tribal historian at the time. And I noticed that there was an envelope behind it and one of them wasn't even opened. So I'm not sure at the time if they read the other envelope that was part of that correspondence, but it was from a university in our homeland. And it was requesting to take 300 plus ancestors into a research lab and give them to a professor who was working with another professor, and they were going to do a study. There was nobody in our tribe 12 years ago who would have even known what that was about, known the complexities, known rights, had any idea of what was that entailed, really. And so I know her, and I know that her workload at that time, and she didn't respond, I guess, fast enough, and there wasn't any other tribal input. And so I ended up following up and checking in with that archaeologist, and I have a good working relationship with him. So, but his thing was, congratulations, you that didn't slip through the cracks. And so they had, after 12 years, reached out to this professor who had in turn taken our ancestors to each posting at universities and never gave them back, are now working with this individual to bring them back to the research facility so that we can work on repatriation. So it's really important not to just assume that somebody doesn't care or they don't want to respond. It's just, sometimes it's just lack of capacity at that point. Right. And so I really encourage you to do your due diligence and practice some of that patience and just recognize that there is all kinds of stuff going on. Like I said in the video, I'm a mother to 3. And so, I know pretty much everybody in my wing has family stuff going on a regular basis, plus our jobs, plus cultural, plus we've got a new cultural center that's coming up. And so that's just here, you magnify that in every community, sometimes it's gonna take a while, but I can attest that at least for all of the Southeastern tribal representatives that I work with, I know that their heart and their passion is in this work. And so it's not for a lack of not wanting or ignoring. So that would be my advice.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. I'm always like, I don't want to be naggy, so that's good advice. Thank you.
I think it's important to understand that just sending a letter is often not enough. And that's why building those relationships is so important, so that, you can call up and that someone will answer your call and you can talk to the people and get that information across.
Yeah. And to be fair, there's some tribal reps that I work with that I'll send an email and the next thing I know, my phone's ringing because they don't want to do email. They want to talk to somebody on the phone. So they could be just waiting for you to call too,
True. Good points. Thank you so much. Do we have any other questions for our speakers? Or maybe just anything that you two want to add?
I'm going to put my email address in the chat, and I'm happy to answer any questions or tell people about the community of practice.
And I'm going to do the same. And so, you know, part of the outreach that Misty and I like to do is we like to go and talk to students. And so I always tell them, and I offer this to you guys as well. If you just want to call me up, practice on me. You know, you've seen my face, you've heard my voice. You know, sometimes it's really intimidating to pick up the phone. It's easier to hide behind an email or a letter and go, okay, I've done it. I'm just going to wait, you know, until they contact me, but just use me, you know, there's my email. If you want to set up a time just to Zoom and go, okay, I thought about asking this, you know, totally willing to do it, whatever we can do to help.
Great. Thank you both so much. That's very much appreciated. You might be hearing from me, actually. Well, if there are no more questions for our speakers, they've dropped their emails in the chat. So I know how that is. Sometimes you think of a question later. And so you're more than welcome to contact them afterwards. But I just like to thank Anne and Deanna both. Thank you so much. I learned a lot personally, so I'm sure that other folks have as well. And if that's it, I think we'll just kind of got some thank yous in the chat. There we go. And then remember, folks, too, as I said, this was recorded. So if you came in a little bit late, not to worry. We'll have this posted in about, I don't know, 2 weeks, just because it has to go through a review process first. But when we do post it, it will be put onto the National EMP's YouTube channel. So keep an eye out for that. All right. All right. Well, have a good night, everybody. Thank you for joining us.